might have been a victim of physical abuse or mental abuse. It might be neglect or homelessness or more than just sort about of extreme isolation. What Jesus does for these 10, everyone at some point also about in their lives brokenness has to deal with some kind of so brokenness. I would guess if I to raise your hands, everyone in this room, our oldest would raise their hand and say that they've experienced some or homelessness or it was some really sort of hard to deal with some of the stuff that we dealt with as our son was growing up. And has to deal with some shame in that, right? And there's frustration and there's guilt. Our oldest son was a very difficult teenager. There's always some sort of and it was really hard in our lives with some stuff that we dealt with as our son was growing up. By no and action there's of our own. Shame in that, right? And there's frustration and there's some guilt sort of brokenness. There's always some sort of and sometimes issue in our lives that desperate to feel that can happen. We'll try anything right to fix that brokenness, and sometimes those things happen in unhealthy ways. Like for example, sometimes desperate to feel better. And donuts. Anything right to fix that brokenness. And sometimes I like those things happen too much. And when COVID started, like for example, and I was stuck at home, I started cooking. I like tacos and donuts. And then I started. Sometimes I like taco and donuts too much. Because what happens when you just eat. And I was stuck at home. I started cooking. Right. So. And then I started, just kind of hiding in my house. Dealt with it till one day I realized this is not working. So I on the diet, just kind of hiding in my house. Dealt with it till one day I realized this is not working. And so that's my problem, and that's how I deal with my frustrations, trying to sadness, better choices, anxiety. Because that's my problem, and that's how I deal with. Sometimes we just try to pretend everything's anxiety, right? Like we just try to pretend everything's having trouble. Right? I don't want anyone else to know that I'm having issues. My marriage really isn't having trouble. I don't want anyone else to know that I'm having issues. We cover up both those kind of physical and emotional bruises. We cover up both those physical and emotional bruises. Yeah, I'm great. Everything's great. Everything's great. When really positivity. Great. Yeah, I'm great. Everything's great. Things are not great. When really it's not struggling. Things are not great. No, I wonder if these lepers had probably already tried a bunch of other things. Had probably already tried a bunch of other things. If you had a magician who came to town and said, I can make that go away, just buy this really great, medication I have, or healing waters, or whatever kind of offer that was given them. I would imagine they would have tried them all, right? Desperate to be fixed. So here they are, and they've heard about Jesus, because everyone's heard about Jesus. It's kind of like being in a church, right? Even if you think nobody knows, everybody knows, right? Something happens, and it spreads like wildfire. And you're like, how did you hear about that? How do you already know that? Well, everyone knew about Jesus without cell phones and Facebook. So they see Jesus coming, and I can imagine the 10 of them are standing there and like, well, what do we got to lose, right? Maybe he's got a suggestion or an idea. Maybe he's can come up with some kind of cure or something. What have we got to lose? So they yell at him from a distance because they're doing the good 10 feet mask thing, and they're like, Jesus, because they were desperate, right? They weren't just desperate to feel better. They were desperate to go home, to be with their family, to be back in the community, to go to worship, to be with their families. They figured, I don't have anything to lose. So I imagine with a great deal of courage, because it wasn't easy to grab his attention. This is kind of like having Billy Graham come through the neighborhood, somebody who everybody knows. They're not going to pay any attention to me, but they took a chance. It took courage, right? Sometimes we don't ask for help in our brokenness because it's comfortable and it's easy, right? It's harder to step out and say, I need help, than it is to just keep living that way day after day. And sometimes I think we're afraid of what will happen about Jesus, because everyone actually heard about Jesus. Deal with our issues, right? It's kind of like being we can't even imagine ourselves anything but the way we are right now. That's our identity. You think nobody knows. We are. And if we become different, something happens, and I think we're afraid of what will happen. Those feelings of unworthiness, if we actually do deal with our issues, right? Special enough, we can't imagine ourselves anything but the way we are right now. That's our identity. The other day, during my prayer time, and if we become, as usual, we're praying for the people in my life that I care about, right? Pastors, feelings of unworthiness on my prayer list, wondering if we're good enough, families on my prayer list, and valuable enough. As usual, I ask for God to protect them from the virus. The other day, makes sense during my prayer time. But I also, as usual, we're praying for the people in my life that I care about, right? Go away, pastors. And I realized I hadn't prayed that on my prayer list for a really long time. As usual, I asked for God to protect them from it. I got so used to it. But I also, that I stopped thinking I could ask, said to God, just make this go away, please. Well, I can't. And I realized, and so now I'm like, I'm not just asking for protection. I did at the beginning for you to fix this problem. I got so used to it to make it go away that I stopped thinking I could ask. And I decided, tells us this morning that when we call out to Jesus, I'm not just asking for protection, even in our brokenness, fix this problem to make it Jesus will respond. Our text tells me. So how does Jesus respond? Our text tells us, he tells the 10, even in our brokenness, show yourself to the priest. Jesus will respond. He doesn't come up and lay his hands on them. So how does Jesus respond? Pray over them. Tells us, he tells go to the 10, yourself to the priest. Okay, you come up and lay his hands on them. The way things work, you're thinking, pray over them. Well, faith says go to the priest. Go to the priest. Okay. Now, if you don't know the way things work, you're thinking that they couldn't go to the priest the way they were standing in front of him. But the reality is they could go, that they couldn't go to the priest the way they were standing in front of him. So when Jesus says go to the priest, Jesus is saying is if they were clean, you can go. And so when Jesus I can only imagine Jesus is saying clean, you can go. What they must have thought when he said that, I mean, their first thought is I can't go. What they must have their second thought is that, I mean, their first thought is I can't go. That means their second thought is I would have turned around as fast as I possibly could, and I'd have been gone. I would have turned around as fast as I possibly could, and I'd have been gone. That if I went to the priest, because I knew, and the priest said you're healed, you know, the stamp of approval, I could go home. They were gone. Can you imagine? Pulse racing, looking at each other, like looking for signs that it was better, looking at themselves, waiting, looking. Oh my gosh, I just can't imagine how excited they must have been, thinking about what they were going to get. You know, it's hard enough to admit that there's something wrong, but it's even harder to ask for help. And in our society, we live in a world where we're judged by the way we look, right? We're judged by what kind of house we have, what kind of car we drive, what kind of job we have, what kind of clothes we wear, how much we weigh, how young we look. Those are judgments that were made. And if we admit that there's something wrong, well, then we're admitting that we're weak, right? That we're strong. The first step to getting help is to actually look in the mirror and say, I need help. I can't do this anymore. And sometimes it isn't just admitting we can't, it's seeking someone else out who can help us, right? Whether that's the doctor to help with that illness. I don't know if any of you have people in your lives like this. I'm going to be a little gender specific here. In my experience, more men are not willing to go to the doctor to seek that problem than women are. You know, you just kind of ignore that little twinge or that little thing. But you have to actually go, right, and make the appointment. If you're having issues with your spouse or your family member, sometimes you need a mediator. You need Jason to be your counselor to help you work through things. It might mean a support group. It might mean packing your kids up and moving out of the house because it's not safe there anymore. But the first thing we have to do is we have to ask God to be a part of the process. The reality is those 10 would not have been healed if they hadn't had the courage to ask for help. It takes both human and divine action to change things. The first step to healing and wholeness was for the lepers and for us to invite God into the process. So a lot of people focus on the second half of this passage, the Samaritan, right? The Samaritan, rushing to the priest, realizes what happens, turns around and comes back and falls at Jesus' feet and says, thank you. Now, a lot of people like to focus on the fact that the other 9 didn't come back, and Jesus asked where they were, and then made it what they were going to get. You know, it's hard enough to admit that there's something wrong, but it's even harder to focus on the fact that they didn't come back, and Jesus asked where they were, and then a comment about this foreigner coming. But according to Jewish law, the Samaritan wouldn't have been clean even when he went to the priest, because he wasn't Jewish. I mean, he had 2 things going against him, right? But he came back because he recognized what God had done for him, and he, with gratitude, gave praise to Jesus. So what does that mean for us, right? What does it mean to be whole? The dictionary defines wholeness as the state of being unbroken, damaged, complete in its parts, no parts missing. The 10 wanted to be physically healed, but more than that, they wanted to no longer be defined by their illness. And isn't what we all want? We don't want to be defined by our pain. We don't want to be defined by our issues or our fears or problems. We don't want to look to other validation to tell us that we're enough or that we're complete. This passage doesn't promise that we're not going to have issues. We're going to get sick. We're going to have difficulties. Brokenness is a part of what it means to live on this earth. Just because you come to church doesn't mean that you're not broken or you're perfect, right? Nobody's promised that. However, Jesus does promise one thing, that even in a brokenness, we're enough. Our imperfections are beautiful to him. But we can only find wholeness, like these 10 did, in Jesus. So now what? Now that we recognize that we're not perfect and that Jesus is part of what makes us whole, what should be our reaction to that? Well, like the Samaritan, we know that God can use our pain and our suffering and our healing to be to what God can and will do for those who love him. We can point other people to Christ. So if I were going to have you raise hands again, I would imagine that everyone in this room and everyone watching live, if I asked you, do you know somebody who's dealing with difficulties, who's experiencing a difficult time? And during COVID, isn't that more amplified than ever before? You have neighbors who've lost jobs. You have family members who are struggling. You might know someone who is ill or has lost someone. And if you're in this room and you love the Porter family, you do. The first thing that we can do is let them know that we can see beyond that brokenness. We see beyond what's going on and recognize them as children of God. And we love them. And we care about them. Then God encourages us and asks us to walk with them, to talk with them, to pray with them, to be with them, because wholeness requires both human and divine action. We are called by God to point others to Jesus so that they too can know Jesus' grace and mercy. As I said, as Christians, there's no free pass. We'll continue to struggle. We will never be perfect until Jesus comes again. But
the 3-in-1, He is Yahweh. Who is He that makes me happy? Who is He that gives me peace? Who is He that brings me comfort? And turns the bitter into sweet. Who is stirring up my passion? Who is rising up me? Who's filling up my hunger with everything I need? Greater God, He is Yahweh. Great I am, He is Yahweh. Lord of all, He is Yahweh. Rose of Sharon, He is Yahweh. The righteous Son, He is Yahweh. The 3-in-1, He is Yahweh. Creator God. Creator God, He is Yahweh. The great I am, He is Yahweh. The Lord of all, He is Yahweh. Rose of Sharon, He is Yahweh. The righteous Son, He is Yahweh. The 3-in-1, He is Yahweh. And I exalt Thee. I exalt Thee. I exalt Thee. Oh, Lord. Let's sing it. We exalt Thee. I exalt Thee.